Hello and welcome to IPM, the programme that starts with its listeners, and this week, a personal opinion on dealing with extremism.
It comes from someone in an unusual position. He spent years working at the UK's National Domestic Extremism Unit.
Which does pretty much what it says on the tin, though the chance of there being a tin with the words National Domestic Extremism Unit is, I grant you, pretty small. You're much more likely to get a tin saying something like Ronseal.
The unit gathers intelligence on groups that show extremist behaviour inside the UK. Groups like neo-Nazis, some animal rights protesters and the English Defence League. It monitors people considered by the unit to be a possible threat.
Why are we talking about the National Domestic Extremism Unit now? Well, last weekend, 160 people were arrested at an English Defence League march. One of our listeners, who works at the unit, thinks the public should be better informed about the way the EDL works. It's tricky for him to do an interview, as you might imagine, but he suggested we get in touch with someone he used to work with. We're going to call him Nick. Now, the EDL. Give me an overview first. I think people might have some notion of what the EDL's about. On the basis of your experience, what is it you understand that maybe isn't more widely understood?
The idea that it's this, the EDL is this or is that, is kind of missing some of the complexities of how it operates. It's certainly not monolithic. It's essentially grown up from local groups, calling themselves divisions, who will buy into the rhetoric coming out of the centre, but the centre, which is really only 2 or 3 people with maybe 4 or 5 clustered around them, maybe. So it's not strictly disciplined. For instance, it's not a membership organisation, it's a supporter organisation. So on that basis, you can buy in and buy out on a event by event or day by day basis.
In your experience working at the unit, what sort of threat did the EDL pose?
The slightly difficult thing about them is that what they say they are and how they appear to be are not necessarily the same thing. Well, it proclaims itself as a non-racist, non-violent movement opposed to extreme political Islam, and the Islamification of Europe is the general sort of terminology that's used. See them on the street, however, you would regard them as probably threatening. Some of the chanting, some of the activity that goes on around their events would certainly, if you're from a Muslim background, you would certainly find it threatening and frightening and concerning. And their presence provokes a counter-demonstration, which is equally, and sometimes if not more so, a threat to public order.
Do you think members of the wider public fully understand what you think they ought to understand about the EDL and what it represents and the potential threat it might pose?
I think there's a need for them to understand what they are and what they're not, the kind of threat they pose as opposed to the kind of threat they think they pose. What I mean is we're obviously aware that if there is an EDL demonstration going to occur in a particular town or city, particularly if it's a large one, then there will be quite understandable fears within the Muslim community living in and around where that event is going to take place, or in the city in general. I'm not in a position to say those threats. You know, the perception of threat is false, because that's something that they experience and I don't experience. I think my take on it would be that the actual threat is probably not as serious as they think it is. Certainly, recently, the EDL, in and of itself, has behaved in a more or less law-abiding manner in a public order sense. I know there have been incidents at mosques, and there have been incidents of people being shouted at, people being jostled, women wearing hijabs, having the hijabs torn off them, particularly in the light of the Woolwich event. There was a spike in events. But it's difficult to a degree to say, well, that's the fault of the EDL, because the EDL say, well, these aren't members. Yes, they might have been to an event. They might come to events regularly, but we don't actually condone this kind of activity. And the EDL would say that we don't actually condone anyone doing that, and we certainly don't want people doing that in our name. It's more complicated than just the EDL do this and they bring this and this is the consequence. It's, I mean, to a large extent, they're playing on a pre-existing background, and I don't know, people having their prejudices or fears confirmed, I think, rather than the EDL necessarily coming into town and, you know, they're going to invade the Muslim quarter and burn down mosques and that kind of thing, because that doesn't happen.
What did, you mentioned Woolwich, what effect did that have on the EDL, its support, and how it behaved?
It had an enormous effect on the EDL. It was started in about 2009 and peaked within 12 to 18 months, where they were, say, getting 2,000 to 3,000 people at one of their national demonstrations. By the spring of this year, for a variety of reasons, a national demo was getting about 500 people. The EDL appeared to have been very much on a downward slope. And I think you'd have to say that the Woolwich incident pressed the reset button or galvanised it.
And how did you notice that?
The primary thing was by quirk of fate, on the Saturday after the Woolwich event took place, there was a national demonstration in Newcastle. If memory serves, rather than maybe the 500 that we would have predicted before the Woolwich event, they got somewhere in the region of 1,000, 1,200, 1,500. Quite a seismic change in their ability to draw people to their events. The reporting we got back was that a lot of the faces were new faces. I mean, one of the other things that we were very conscious of was that the number of likes on their Facebook page was around about 20,000 before the Woolwich event, and it went up to about 140,000 within, essentially by the weekend. Now, a Facebook like is not quite the same as actually wanting to associate them physically, quite apart from wanted to, carry out racial attacks or that kind of thing, but indicative of perhaps a change within some sections of the public as how they were being viewed.
How does someone come into the view of the National Domestic Extremism Unit?
There isn't actually a definition of what domestic extremism is.
Whether that's a good or a bad thing.
Certainly there isn't a legal definition of what it is. We tended to operate on the basis of people who were prepared to commit crime in order to further their political beliefs or political cause. And there are various checks and balances in place in terms of what you can reasonably expect to find out and reasonably expect to be told. But that's part of the day-to-day work. You don't ask for stuff that you don't really proportionately want. It's you get into the flow of how to think around it and how to find stuff out. But it's not tidy, and you would have, I'm sure there would be people who would go, well, I don't see why I would fall within the purview of that unit, and our response might be, well, at such a time you did this, or you came in because of that, or it's.
What is your? I know there's a limit to the sort of detail you can go into. So I am interested to get your take on doing this work every day for a long time as you did. What did you take from it in terms of, I don't know, did your views change? Did you get a sense of? I don't
think my views changed. I know what the NDU does is not terribly popular. There are certain newspapers that aren't terribly favourable, shall we say.
Do you blame them for that, by the way? I mean, you know what the criticisms are.
No, one of them happens to be the daily newspaper that I read by choice. So no, I don't have any. I read a quote in a book, and I'll paraphrase it because I don't think I can memorise it fully. But if you live in a pluralistic democracy and you tolerate extremism, the price of that is eternal vigilance. And I have no personal qualms about being part of that vigilance.
And do you think there's been a change? Because there may have been a day when pretty much everybody listening to the sort of work that you and your colleagues did would say, well, good for you. I'm glad you're protecting us, glad you're looking after us, keep those extremists under the thumb. And maybe now, for all sorts of reasons, a greater proportion of people might say, well, I'm a bit suspicious about the work you're doing, or are you sure you're not looking at innocent people, and what sort of controls are there in the work you're doing? Do you think there has been a change? I think people are more, if not suspicious, then certainly questioning than they might have been even 5 or 10 years ago about the sort of work you do.
I think there is a greater level of suspicion about that kind of activity being carried out on behalf of the state, if you will.
And does that bother you? I mean, you must see yourself as the good guys, and to have that suspicion, is that not all?
Well, I think.
Despite the newspaper you read?
Well, you very soon get into the mindset that it's not reasonable for the public to actually understand what you do and why you do it, because they can't know everything that you know, and they can't know how you go about knowing it.
The experience of one former member of the National Domestic Extremism Unit.